don't know if you've heard, Chris, but the Mets have a new owner. It's Steve Cohen. The Wilpons finally pulling the plug after a number of years. Are they the Wilpons or the Coupons? I don't know which one, but regardless, there's new ownership. Steve Cohen, of course, with a lot of money and resources at his disposal to try and reshape this Mets organization that has sputtered the last couple of years amid some pretty hefty expectations, have not been to the postseason in a couple of years coming off that World Series run in 2015 and haven't been able to really recapture that form as of recently. So we're breaking down some of the offseason priorities for the Mets. Mr. Baccia, what is number one for you on that list?
Number one on that list is it's probably Trevor Bauer. It's probably a combination of Trevor Bauer, JT Realmuto, and George Springer. I would say go out and get them all. I'm not
sparing no expense.
No, because this guy's worth $14 billion.
Fair enough.
So I'm not super nuanced about it because I am really in a position of wait and see. Whereas in the past, I was an outspoken advocate for what the Mets need to do to a team that I knew wasn't going to do it. In this case, for the first time ever, I'm under the belief that this is a team that is actually going to behave like a New York team, more so than it had in the past, but more so than all of these other pathetic New York franchises. We've talked a good deal about the Jets and Giants. This is a Met team that for the first time, perhaps in its history, with the exception of a few years, is positioned to rival a Yankees team. And I don't know that that comes soon because this is a much better Yankee team than it is a Met team. And unfortunately, it's a Met team that if we talked 2 years ago or even a year ago, I would have said is as good or better than the Yankees. But things have changed and the window has shrunk. But obviously, a lot of hope. And I'll start. I think Steve Cohen's first move, which is Sandy Alderson, is a good one. And Sandy Alderson knows his way around the Mets organization, which is a good first step, but also one of the better executives really in the history of this game, and someone who I think oversees a good general manager hire. And from that point, I think the Mets are not only factors in the free agent market, probably the biggest players in the free agent market, but also absolutely players in the trade market. And, to wrap it up, we saw the Mookie Betts deal be the difference between a team that kept getting to the World Series to a team that won the World Series. And so the trade market becomes very important. And I imagine that the Mets will be on the prowl there.
The interesting thing to me, and we got into this again this past weekend, and the most important thing is that the Mets now have an identity about what type of organization they want to be. Yep. Because a lot of times in the past few years, they were sort of in flux. Are they a team that wants to budget and wants to operate like the Tampa Bay Rays or the Oakland A's, where you're sitting there and saying, look, we're spending $90 million. We have to build our farm system, and we're going to have to get our young players up to develop and play well, and that's how we're going to win. And then when they are on expiring contracts, we're going to trade them away because we need to recoup the value and start the cycle all over again. Or are we the New York Yankees who will perennially put as many resources and as much money behind being competitive as we need to and operate as a big spender? Nobody is unavailable for trade. Nobody is unavailable in the offseason when there's a piece that we feel like is out there to put us over the top, i.e. Garrett Cole. We are going to jump all over that. 9 years, $320+ million. That's not too much for us. We will make that deal if we think it can win us a championship. Those are the two polar opposites, and I always felt like the Mets were in the middle of that. They weren't big spenders, but then would operate in a way that did not value the prospects that they had at their disposal, and that was more apparent, in my opinion, when Brodie Van Wagenen took the reins in the last couple of years, where he has really not made an effort to build up the farm system, but rather trade young players away to try and get some veterans who he feels like could help and contribute, and that's great. but they didn't really have the structure for that. And when you don't have the budget and you're not spending in that way and you're caught in the middle and not developing on the young side, there's not much coming up when you have some of those injuries and some of those holes that have become a problem for the Mets in these past couple of years. Their rotation was great in 2019. Well, that was because everyone was healthy. Then you had a couple injuries. Stroman opts out, Syndergaard to Tommy John, and you're talking about pitching Rick Porcello and Michael Wacha at the back end of your rotation because you've got nobody in terms of young players who can come up and fill those roles. In 2019, the bullpen was brutal. They didn't have anybody who could come up and maybe stabilize what was going on, or even then make a trade that made sense from a prospect pool to help their bullpen and make a run. So there was just so much there where they were in between. And I think that's the most positive thing, where now they're pointed in a direction. They are the same type of organization that the Yankees are, that the Red Sox are. They have the money and the resources at their disposal. And by the way, that doesn't mean everything. My favorite stat, of course, is that in 2019, 3 out of the top 5 teams in Major League Baseball's payroll did not make the playoffs. So it's not about necessarily how much you spend. The Red Sox spent a lot of money on Hanley Ramirez and Pablo Sandoval one offseason, and guess what? That didn't work out. And you can go through the long list of teams that have tried on free agents and they have not gotten the returns that they expected on big contracts. So it's not all about just handing them out. But to me, the most important thing is that from an organizational structure perspective, where who the heck knew what Brodie Van Wagenen was doing, what the Wilpons wanted to do, whether it was make a trade and take on Cespedes as contractor. Oh, now we're a small budget team and can't go out and spend. Now they know what their direction is, and now you're going to go and try and operate on that. And I agree with you. Trevor Bauer would be a great addition to that team if they can get him. JT Realmuto, I think, is a bit of a long shot. I think it seems like he would stay in Philadelphia, but if they can get him, he's another great addition to the team if you feel like that's somebody who is attainable. So George Springer, another great guy you could plug and play in center field with some of the little production they've got out of that spot at times over the last couple of years. So I agree with all those points that you made. And I would also say that I would try and add to that bullpen that has been sort of a big bugaboo for them the last couple of years, and not understanding exactly what you're going to get from Edwin Diaz year to year, and Dellin Betances, who's going to be back for another year. But how healthy is he, and how much of the real Dellin Betances are you getting, and how much is that injury affecting him as he pitches later on in these stages of his career? So I think that it's about, in addition to that starting pitching, grabbing some bullpen help. But I think the Mets are in a good position, and now it's about making the smart decisions with that money that they have at their disposal. And you have to be more confident that Sandy Alderson is going to push the right buttons than Brodie Van Wagenen. And of course, Brodie's still there, but Sandy's going to be running and calling the shots.
Yeah, and who really knows how long Brodie will be there. Couple points here. Now I'm under the belief that when the Mets have a hole to fill, when they have a 4th starting pitcher or a 5th guy, they're not going to go make a budget move. Rick Porcello and Michael Wacha were budget moves. And they were actually, from some circles, they said, oh, good move. You got him at a good value. This is not a value enterprise. That's not how you operate in New York. If Tampa Bay goes and gets a good 4th for their rotation, and you're talking about, good value move, okay. But that's just not what this is. The second point is that the Mets are very close to being in a place where they've missed their moment. And when you went to the World Series in 2015, that could have been your moment. Didn't have to be, though. You still had a lot of youth and a lot of talent, and you said, we're going to be back here. Whether if it's not next year, it'll be the following year. We're going to be back here, though. We've assembled one of the best young rotations in recent memory, and had the chance to be one of the best in baseball history. It didn't shake out that way. Matt Harvey was gone pretty quickly. Zach Wheeler's now not there. But I no longer fear that I'm going to have to watch Noah Syndergaard pitch in, God forbid, a Yankee uniform or another Yankee uniform or another uniform. I'm more under the impression that I'll see the day when he signs a contract to be a Met for life. And the same goes for Peter Alonso. The same goes for Jake DeGrom when his sort of midterm contract begins to run out. That these guys will be Mets for life. Mets for life. If it has to be done, it will be done. The Wilpons will point to a couple of times where they spent For instance, they gave David Wright $138 million. They paid up Johan Santana. They paid Yoenis Cespedes. But you'll realize that what followed each one of those transactions was a year or two or more of inactivity. After they paid out Cespedes, they were pretty much done in terms of big contracts. They did take on Robinson Cano's contract, which was just an awful allocation of whatever funds they had. But they were working on a stringent budget. That need not be the case when you are one piece or two pieces away from a World Series. And there's no question that in the last 5 years, they've been in the position almost every year of being a piece or two away from a World Series. And they've missed it. They've missed it every year. So the window is closing. And we've been saying it. The window is closing. So here it is. The hope is that Steve Cohen comes in, salvages it at the last moment, and perhaps gets what is and what could very well be a great Met team in history. One of the best teams that they've ever put on the field when you're talking about Peter Alonso and Jeff McNeil to begin with on offense. And that, of course, is not the end of it offensively. But then on the other side, you're talking about the greatest pitcher that I've ever seen, almost definitely the greatest pitcher that I will ever see in Jacob deGrom. And you've got to ask the question, how are you not investing the house into this team right now? And the reason was because this is an ownership group that absolutely was always working on a budget and probably working on borrowed cash. We know what happened with the scandal with Madoff. And so here we are, finally freed of the monkey on the Mets back, which has for a long time been this ownership group. And every single Met fan that you will ever talk to knows it, that this is the root of all of their problems. We're finally in a place where if it's one piece or two pieces, now it's probably a little bit more than that, but whatever it is, they'll spend the money that needs to be spent to get it right.
I thought what you said about the pieces away was interesting, and that's what I wanted to get to next when you're talking about the moves that they need to make in this particular offseason. How many pieces do you think they are away? Because when you look at their roster, in my opinion, I feel like, okay, I like what they have in their starting rotation. I didn't hate even last year and this year what they had in their bullpen, and their lineup seemed to do well at times. And you like what you have with Alonso, albeit a down year, but with the assortment of pieces that they have in that lineup, Conforto as well, McNeil. And yet they're not making the playoffs. This is not even a team that is, okay, we lost in the division series or lost in the NLCS. This is a team that hasn't made the playoffs the last couple of years. So I get what you're saying about how you're one or two pieces away and that they'll spend it. But to me, this team feels like they're a little bit farther than just the 1 to 2 pieces away, because even guys that they've brought in and felt like they could rely on haven't stepped up. So you feel like now they've got to make some major moves in the bullpen. They got to address some of their position players in the back end of that rotation. How close do you think they are? Because it's weird. I agree with you in saying that I feel like they should be close, but they haven't put it together and haven't been able to even scratch the playoffs.
Well, closer than it may seem. 2019 was a team where they were, let's say, two pieces away. They were a bat and a top flight relief arm away from doing it. And where they plugged those holes was with Robinson Cano and Edwin Diaz. And not only were those not the fixes where they needed fixes and they needed pieces, but they were completely counterproductive. And they took that team back. I mean, Edwin Diaz blew, I can't remember how many saves, but it was almost double digits.
Records.
And that was a hard one to even blame the general manager on because of the track record he established in Seattle. Robinson Cano, you could have seen coming. It was a player that was itching for a decline. It was like everybody was waiting for Robinson Cano to decline, and the Mets got him at the very moment that decline began. And you could certainly point to some indicators that it was coming, and his age being chief among them. So there you were in 2019 with a team that really should have been good. And I would say the same goes for 2018 and 2017. 2016, they had tough injuries down the stretch. but this team is closer than it looks. But they are probably further than they were the couple of years that I referenced earlier. In that the rotation is no longer the sure thing that it was. Um, Zach Wheeler's not there, and Steven Matz is a guy that we've been waiting to step up for now at this point too long. It's too long to keep waiting. So there's real work that needs to be done in the rotation. The offense to me is probably more promising than the pitching at this point. But one thing that you know about the pitching is that if you supply this staff with some offense, Jacob deGrom virtually guarantees you a win once every 5 days. That hasn't been the case. Somehow they've managed to lose more games with him on the mound, which is the most baffling and most Mets thing that there is. But, forgive me for launching into the supernatural a little bit, but I do believe that there's an aura around a baseball team, that there's some voodoo that is working. And it's been bad voodoo for so long. I'd say the same about the New York Jets. But the idea is that that something has left the building with the Wilpons, something that's the spirit of that ownership group is finally gone. And Steve Cohen brings a brazen energy. He brings he brings the can-do attitude that I'm excited to see in New York. It sort of feels Steinbrenner-ish. I wouldn't dare make the comparison to the incomparable, but it seems to resemble that in Queens, and it absolutely sets up a very exciting baseball landscape for our city when football certainly isn't giving it to us. Basketball hasn't given it to us. So to me, finally, some real promise in New York.